Welcome, everyone, to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Got more good content for you, and I'm hoping you'll agree with me once you hear as I introduce the guest who will be with me after our first break. If you're new to the show, What's Working is the show about workplace, workforce, and marketplace trends. Our goal is always to find people who can speak to the trends in such a way that you and I can learn a little bit about them and hopefully apply them to our own world, our own businesses, whatever it may be. Try to find guests who can make us a little bit better through the conversation that I'm about to have. I'll tell you about my guest in a moment. But I come back, I'm sitting behind the microphone for the first time in a month. For the first time in 7 years, took some time off from the radio show. Even when I'd take vacations in times past, I always doubled up to get the content ready so that the stations would have something to play. And this is the first time that I told the producer of the show and sent him 4 reruns and said, hey, I need you to edit these to fit into the slots as reruns. I'm taking a month off. And it was a very refreshing month, and it makes me very excited to get into what we've gotten going into. I hear about the Europeans that take a holiday. We take vacations. They take a holiday. I have very seldom met anyone who works full-time that's taken more than a week off, unless they're European. So I've been working during the past month, but I have not been focused on this radio show with What's Working. I've missed it. I've missed meeting the people that I interview. I've learned about myself that one of the places that I draw energy is meeting people, asking questions, and satisfying my endless curiosity. That curiosity is both a blessing and a curse. So it's been nice. You'll hear a renewed energy in my voice. My guest today is Ron McBay. Ron and I met through a kind of a networking happenstance, if you will. Ron works for NATO. He's actually employed, I think, by the National Guard. He and I spent about 2 hours over coffee as I just couldn't stop asking questions. But we spent about 2 hours meeting each other. He works for NATO, and his job is going to some of these non-NATO countries using the expertise of the U.S. military, in which he has a background, to talk to them, and he's been trained and educated as an attorney, to talk to them about peacekeeping from a NATO point of view. And he works with, I'm looking at my notes here, he's worked in the Balkans. He was last in Armenia and Moldova. Kosovo is a part of his background. And when he and I sat there talking about it, it was remarkable to me, his knowledge of how to avoid conflict, how to avoid uprisings and try to prevent the Russian influence in these nations. And I'll ask him to get further into the weeds in that when we come back. This show is typically focused, as you know, on business, workplace, workforce trends. However, and I'm going to delve into politics a little here, which I have previously said I wouldn't do. As the election looms, one of the candidates' pledges is to get us out of any sort of NATO commitments. And he has said that a number of times. He talks about other countries needing to pay their dues, and Ron and I will talk about that. I think there's another side to the story that we need to understand, and Ron McBay, in his experience, has seen it firsthand. And I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit of that story so we can understand what he sees when he's overseas. So this will be interesting. This will be a little bit different. I'm happy to be back behind the microphone for What's Working. It's been a nice month's break. I hope you enjoyed the reruns. I gave you the 4 of my favorite in this year that I think are kind of evergreen in content, will always be helpful content to listen to over and over again. I hope you enjoyed them. It's time for new content. When we come back from break, Ron McBay and I will be talking about his work with NATO and what it means to normal people like you and me. Be right back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. Again, thank you for joining me. Across from me is Ron McBay. He's a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard. He's a National Guard officer. Spent some time recently in Armenia. As I told you in the opening comments, he and I met through kind of a networking thing, and we were networked together, and when he and I talked, it was very interesting, and I think the conversation would be very salient for us today, considering what's going on out there. Ron, first and foremost, thank you so much for your time, and welcome to What's Working.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your background, your role with the National Guard, and then let's get into what you were doing in Armenia and why you and I both feel it's an important conversation today.
So I've been a guardsman for almost 40 years now. Right now, my role is as a judge advocate. I'm a lawyer in the Army.
Are you trained as a lawyer, law school? Okay.
Yes, I'm licensed to practice in Alabama. I went to Cumberland and Birmingham. So my job right now is to provide trial defense services to senior leaders in the National Capital Region. But the previous year, between April of 23 and April 24, I served as the Deputy Chief Legal Advisor for the NATO force in Kosovo, which is commonly referred to as KFOR.
KFOR, the NATO force in Kosovo, is abbreviated to KFOR.
Correct.
And you were there for a year, an entire year, or did you come and go?
Well, I was assigned there for a year. I traveled to different places during that year. I think around 14 or 15 different European countries that I traveled to with regard to that mission.
And you were doing exactly what on a day-to-day basis in Armenia? So
Armenia was an 8-day mission with the Defense Institute for International Legal Studies, and that's an organization that provides training to foreign militaries that request it and pay for it. With regard to legal aspects of peacekeeping was the mission in Armenia. Armenia sends a contingent of soldiers to Kosovo on 6 months rotation to guard the what we call the APOD, or the airport there in Pristina, and they requested training for the legal aspects of peacekeeping missions. And so we were there for about 8 days total, training that contingent.
The legal aspects of peacekeeping missions. So this is not any sort of tactical training you're providing of how to, whatever a tactical training may be. This is, if something happens, here are the legal components to that. Is that, am I oversimplifying it?
Well, we focus on generally the NATO rules of engagement, which governs the use of force in any particular area. We also talk about human rights law, international humanitarian law, rights afforded civilians under the Geneva Conventions, and generally we'll give them an overview, or I will personally give them an overview of my experience there as the legal advisor, having been there for a year in Kosovo, where they're going.
What do you mean where they're going? What their trajectory is?
Right. Well, they're going to send a group of soldiers, Armenian soldiers, to Kosovo, and that group will be there for around 6 months.
Yeah.
And so while they're there, they may encounter different situations that will require them to interact with civilians, to make decisions about whether or not to use force, whether or not to use lethal force in any given situation. So the more training that they can have going into that, the more likely they're going to be to make good decisions and not create international incidents.
So the people in the room with you that you're training, that you're standing in the front of the room, you're looking into the eyeballs of a group of people, who exactly are they?
Well, in Armenia, it was mostly a group of officers.
Yeah.
Armenia is just coming out of a conflict with Azerbaijan over a disputed region called Nagorno-Karabakh. So a few of these folks are actual combat veterans in that conflict. And this was more of a train the trainer kind of event where you help. The goal is to create an environment in the Armenian army that's respectful of international law and trains them on how to comply with international norms of peacekeeping operations.
Yeah. So you were invited there. Why? You and I talked about this when you and I met the first time. Why were you invited? You have knowledge, you have education. Obviously, they're wanting that, but there's something above that. There's something macro to that in what the reason they wanted you there.
Well,
what is that?
I'm the most recent U.S. Army judge advocate to rotate out of Kosovo.
Yeah.
So I've got the most recent experience as a legal advisor coming out of that theater.
Yeah.
So and that's how I get picked up by, we call it DILS. DILS called me up and said, hey, we're going to do this training. We'd like for you to join us.
And they want you there because the education you're providing keeps them in check with NATO. They're not a NATO country, but it keeps them in check with NATO. It keeps the Russians from running over their border. What?
Well, it helps them progress as a military and to get to the point where they are operating as close to NATO standards as they can be. Now, Armenia is not, as you said, not a NATO country, but they're what we call in Kosovo a troop contributing nation. So a partner nation, if you will. There are other partner nations that are not NATO members, like Switzerland, Austria, Ireland. The Irish Defence Force sends a contingent to Kosovo, and so it's incumbent upon them to train up those soldiers that are going to that international arena, right, where they're going to have exposure beyond the borders of their country, Armenia. And prior to that, we were in Chisinau, Moldova, right, which is another former Soviet bloc country that sends contingent to Kosovo for part of the mission there.
So the NATO exists to stem, and I'm going to oversimplify this. This is not my expertise, but NATO exists to stem Russian aggression.
I think that was part of the original purpose of NATO. NATO's a treaty organization, with that unites governments that are like-minded with regard to democracy and individual freedom, and basically market capitalism, and that's have agreed that if one is attacked, then it's treated as an attack on every nation.
And these contributing countries send their troops to help out the NATO cause.
Yes, they assist in the NATO mission there. And some of those countries, like Armenia or Moldova, may have aspirations to join NATO.
Yeah, that was I was getting to. I can't help but wonder if their motivation, and I want to talk about your opinions on the value of these things, but these countries' motivations, could it be to say, hey, we'd like to get a good look from you guys, NATO, at some point when we have our ducks in a row?
That is certainly part of it for a nation like Moldova and Armenia. But for instance, Ireland will never. If Ireland had wanted to be a part of NATO, they could have joined early on. And same thing with Switzerland; it's declared neutral.
Yeah.
Austria hasn't voiced any designs to join NATO. So it is part of a pathway that a nation can go on if they desire NATO membership. There were Ukrainians in Kosovo prior to the Russian invasion. They're assisting with the mission just like the Armenians or the Moldovans.
Let's get into that when we get back from break. I'm sitting with Ron McBay, Lieutenant Colonel in the National Guard, just got back from overseas, talking about his work for NATO. This is fascinating to me. You're listening to What's Working. We'll be right back.
This is Bill Eastet. I perfected my baking recipe behind my live music stage at my little restaurant in Fairhope, Alabama. We have custom-made smokers and small batch bacon made just for you. So if you're looking for the best bacon in America that has been cured, smoked, and even serenaded by songwriters, you definitely need to try Billy's Small Batch Bacon. www.billysbacon.com.
We are back. You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. In the studio today, sitting across from me is Ron McBay. He's a lieutenant colonel with the National Guard, recently spent time overseas. And if you've been paying attention, Ron is talking about the training he gives the officer in kind of a train-the-trainer role that is based on NATO laws. I'm dumbing this down for myself. And Ron, when you and I met for coffee to talk about this, you gave me an example of how these laws play out based on a confrontation that happened between, if I have my notes correctly, the Muslims and the Serbian Orthodox.
So
give me the location first. Let's set this up.
So the main event was May 29th, 2023 in a northern municipality of Kosovo called Zvechan, Zvechan. And I want to clarify a little bit. First, there are NATO rules of engagement, and then there are also K4 rules of engagement that are approved by NATO. And in Kosovo, you have people who identify as Serbians and people who identify as Albanians. They're all residents of Kosovo, but ethnically speaking, the Serbians are Orthodox Christians, and the Albanians are generally Muslims. Now, there were a good 18 months of back and forth leading up to the events of May 29th, but on that day, an Albanian mayor who had been elected because the Serbian majority had boycotted the elections went to go take his office in the municipal building. And NATO forces were already there, along with Kosovo police forces. And
the NATO forces anticipated a struggle, a challenge of some sort.
Right. There had been regular protests leading up to this event. And so because K4 was in a unique role at this time, because rather than assisting the Kosovo police or the European rule of law mission there, in controlling a potential riot, K4 was there to stand between the Kosovo police and the protesters. And early in the day, two vehicles that had Kosovo police officers had gotten stranded behind the line of the protesters. You had in crowd and riot control operations, you have what's called a crash line. That's basically the line where the guys with the shields and the batons and the helmets are.
See these pictures.
Right. And so you had Hungarians, Italians, and Austrians and Polish soldiers manning this line. The on-scene commander was an American commander from the Indiana National Guard. And the soldiers on the crash line don't have weapons other than their batons and their shields. Now, there were U.S. Soldiers backing them up that were armed, with rifles and pistols and lethal force. And then further behind them were the Kosovo police, who were basically, we were trying to keep them in the building. And I wasn't there personally. I was just monitoring it from the Capitol there in Pristina. But this group of Kosovo police officers were stranded behind the pro-Serbian protesters. And as time went on, the protesters were damaging the vehicles they were in. They were spraying foam into the air ducts. They were doing things that could have been threatening, right, to the Kosovo police in the vehicles, and the Kosovo police in the building were worried about their comrades.
Sure.
And wanted to get them out. So this went on for hours, almost 8 hours.
8 hours these guys were in the car.
Of the U.S. commander negotiating with some of the leaders in the crowd, trying to say, hey, we need to get these guys in. They're like, no. It went back and forth that long. And finally, the U.S. commander made the decision that he would give the order to move the crash line forward to the point where they could envelop the vehicles, get the Kosovo police out, and then reform the crash line. And he gave a 10-minute warning to the crowd that this was about to happen. And during that time, they took advantage of the 10 minutes and gathered up what force they had there with Molotov cocktails and grenades and other weapons. And when the order was given to move the crash line, they started throwing those things into the K4 crash line.
Yeah.
And you can see from the video that I sent you that it was a pretty violent scene with folks using sticks and batons back and forth. There were there were about 40 K4 soldiers injured. I think 2 Hungarian soldiers had to have amputations below the knees because it turned out that there actually live hand grenades were thrown into the group of K4 soldiers.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, these K4 soldiers are not armed with lethal weapons. They're just carrying a shield and a baton pushing forward.
Right. Because the rules of engagement don't allow for the use of lethal force except in matters of self-defense. Right. And so this gets back to the training.
That's right. This is all coming back to the training you delivered.
So once it was determined that lethal force had been used by the crowd on K4 forces, that opens up a door to responding with lethal force in self-defense. However, part of the training is also, in order to use lethal force, you have to be able to identify a target.
You can't just shoot
into a crowd.
Yeah.
Right. And so the commander there on the ground never authorized the use of lethal force, even though technically if a target could have been identified, right, and in theory lethal force could have been used in response. But
so hand grenades were being thrown. You don't know where those came from, who threw them, and whether they had more. Had they had that information, or perhaps could have seen someone in the act of throwing one, they could have used lethal force in that moment.
In theory, yes, they would have been authorized to do that.
Yeah. So the rules of engagement which you have taught which you were teaching, were what formed that line, told the line to push forward, taught them to resist any sort of effort to use lethal force. In hindsight, and my experience with the military being very little that it is, there's often a thorough debrief, a evaluation. Did the laws change after that incident?
Well, one of the main issues, and as far as the legal advisor goes, is the legal advisor K4 is responsible for writing the one of the standard operating procedures is detention. Right? What do you do when you need to detain somebody in the course of these peacekeeping operations? In that case, there were 4 protesters pulled off the line by NATO forces and handed over to the Kosovo police. And what we determined from the after action review and reviewing the statements and the video and the documentary evidence is that the SOP that existed at the time was very cumbersome and didn't really allow for those heat of the moment kinds of times where maybe you got to move somebody for their own safety. Maybe you're stopping them from doing something that could be harmful. Yeah. And then turning them over directly to Kosovo police. So that was one of the changes that I wrote in a new SOP was to give a little more flexibility to soldiers on a crash line.
You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston in the studio with Ron McBay, Lieutenant Colonel, National Guard officer, spent time training on behalf of NATO. We're talking about the effects of his training, what it actually looked like when it was executed in a true moment of conflict. We'll be back after this break. Again, you're listening to What's Working.
This is Seth Cherniak, Vice President of Branch Development for the Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group. If you're an experienced financial advisor wanting the freedom of independence, but aren't sure making that jump is right for you, we should talk. Jeffrey Matthews has developed a successful program for advisors who don't want to be 1099 contractors and don't want to pay for their own overhead. We're looking for advisors who want the freedom to run their business the way they see fit, with the support that comes with a W-2 firm. If you're interested in joining one of our branches, or if you want to open your own branch as a full-time employee, let's chat. Our compensation plan is one of the most competitive among all W-2 firms, big or small. Reach out to us today at jeffreymatthews.com, connect with me, Seth Cherniak, on LinkedIn, or click the link in the podcast.
Jeffrey Matthews Financial Group, member FINRA, SIPC. We're back. You're listening to What's Working. Thank you again for joining us on this episode. Across from me is Ron McBay, Lieutenant Colonel with the National Guard. Ron, a big part of the current political climate, and I'm not asking either of us to weigh in on anything here, but to just discuss it, is NATO and its value. And there's one side that seems to think our commitment to them should not be blemished. The other side seems to think it's something that we could do away with without a cause for concern. I'm not asking you to evaluate that, but tell us exactly, with your experience, what is involved with being a member of NATO?
So to become a NATO member, a country has to agree to 2 basic things. And one is to spend at least 2% of their GDP on national defense. And the other is to agree to the terms of the NATO treaty. And Article 5 of the NATO treaty is the article which specifies that an attack on one is considered an attack on all. And while I'm talking about Article 5, the only time it's ever been invoked, I'm going to point out, is in the defense of the United States when we were attacked for 9/11.
Yeah, I do remember that conversation. But let me clarify something. So it's not a dues paying. You just got to spend 2% of your GDP on national defense. Your own national defense or a defense structure that you can loan out?
No, you spend it on your own national defense.
Yeah.
For example, the forces in K4, the nations that send the forces pay their They pay for their equipment. They pay for their meals. So it's not that there are NATO funds, but it's not a dues paying organization.
Yeah.
Right. For example, Armenia sends that group to Kosovo, Armenia pays for them unless they may have a contract with some other nation to assist, but that doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Right.
Right. That's a bilateral agreement between Armenia and whatever other country that they're dealing with. So NATO, there of course there's a headquarters there in Belgium, and there's a command structure, right? And normally always headed by a 4-star U.S. commander in each of the high commands there. And but it's not a dues paying organization.
Right. So the laws of NATO, which you are in charge of interpreting and training on, are created by whom?
Well, the NATO regulations, just like the U.S. Army doesn't necessarily have laws other than
laws was a poor
Uniform Code of
choice of
Military
words.
Justice,
Yeah.
right?
The regulations.
They have regulations that are decided on and ultimately approved by what's called the North Atlantic Council. Anything that NATO publishes, any rules or regulations that come out, has to be agreed on unanimously by all the members.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, of course, that would get very cumbersome to get down in the weeds of every little detailed regulation. Right. But generally speaking, the North Atlantic Council either will make the decision or delegate the authority to make the decision on whatever rules there are to implement.
Yeah.
And these are general guidelines, right? For example, at the U.S. base there in Kosovo, Camp Bonesteel, that's been there for 25 years, they have an ammo storage facility, right? And it's operated according to U.S. regulations and laws. And the Italians over in Prizren, they have a base there that they operate their ammunition storage facility according to Italian rules. NATO is there to make sure that some rules are being followed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that it's not a danger to the welfare and safety of NATO or partner nation soldiers who are deployed in support of the mission.
How does this NATO, let's bring it into the current day, almost the current moment, apply to the Ukraine? When we were having coffee, there is a connection there. So what is the connection?
So it's my understanding that at the time of the Russian invasion, that there had been a movement toward the West in Ukraine. That prior to, there had been some back and forth as far as pro-Russian or pro-Western governments there in Ukraine. But under President Zelensky, they were moving toward the West and had aspirations of gaining NATO membership.
Yeah.
And so obviously that has all been put on hold because you don't want to enter into a treaty with a nation that's already under attack,
right?
Because that would automatically mean that NATO nations would be obligated to come to Ukraine's aid, and there's no way you get 30 nations to agree to do that all at once, because it does take a unanimous agreement to admit someone. And so what I understand is that the Russians see this encroachment into what was normally their sphere of influence, and Ukraine being actually the largest nation on the European continent,
mm-hmm.
and the breadbasket of Europe or the world, depending on who you ask. The Russians took this opportunity to execute what I'm sure they thought was going to be a very quick strike to take over Kiev and install a friendly government. And of course that didn't happen. We're 2+ years into it. And when we as the United States or Germany or Great Britain supply military aid, right, especially in the United States, if we say there's a military package of $300 million, it's not like we write a check to Ukraine for $300 million, right? We pay U.S. producers, suppliers of whatever weapons packages we're sending to them. U.S. folks manufacture it, right? They ship it, and ultimately Ukraine's the beneficiary of that. But there's that money's spent in the United States.
Yeah,
now, there is money that there are funds that go directly to Ukraine. I don't want to get into all that. But generally speaking, military aid is the provision of arms, right, from U.S. suppliers.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the notes that I have from our previous conversation is Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons to get protection.
Yes. When the Soviet bloc broke up, part of Ukraine had control of the nuclear stockpile. And as part of gaining their independence from Russia, right, they agreed to give up their nuclear stockpile, return it to Moscow in exchange for security guarantees from the West.
Uh-huh. And
now as far as the details of those security agreements, I'm not an expert on that. But it'd be interesting to imagine what decisions would have been made differently had Ukraine not given up their nuclear weapons at that time. And Russia really wasn't in a position to enforce that in the early 90s anyway.
As a guy that's seen it so much more than the rest of us have, is NATO a good thing or not a good thing?
Our alliance with NATO is important. It's vital to our national defense strategy.
Very simply put. Ron, I sure appreciate your time. We've been, it's a subject matter, it's references to items that I've often heard about, but it's the first time we've gotten into the weeds on it, or I've learned a little bit about the weeds in this thing. Thank you so very much.
Pleasure's all mine.
You're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. That's Ron McBay, National Guard officer, lieutenant colonel with an expertise on NATO that I've never met before. When we come back from this break, we'll be into Segment 5. And Segment 5 is where I kind of recap what I've heard and tell you what to expect next. Again, you're listening to What's Working. I'm Cam Marston. We'll be right back.
I'm Joey Mason. For 4 years, my goal has been to produce the best farm-to-table products I'd ever eaten. I've done just that at our on-site USDA facility in Grand Bay, Alabama, allowing us to ship directly to your door. This is true farm-to-table. Visit us at masonhillsfarm.com to see all that we have to offer.
Well, that was interesting. I think it's important for us to know that NATO doesn't have dues. And that was somewhat of an education to me. NATO says to be a member, you must spend a percentage of your GDP on your own defense, essentially, so that the aggressors of the world don't see you as obviously weak and come roll right through you. So it's not a dues-paying organization. You got to pay for your own defense. And I think it's also interesting that there are attorneys out there that interpret the NATO laws and then go train people on how to enforce those laws, those rules, not laws. He was very clear to say that. Train those people on how to enforce and live within those rules in such a way that there's no issues there. I've heard about NATO since I was a child, learning about it in school, and this is the first time I've ever met somebody that actually is directly involved with them. So appreciate it, Ron. Thank you very much. Turning the subject a little bit here towards the tail end of the show, Recently, I've done a lot of travel to my clients to discuss their workforce issues, and their big complaints have been with Gen Z lately. Roughly those that are about 24, 25 years old and younger. They struggle to connect. They struggle to communicate with them. One group of physicians actually talked about that they just wouldn't work. Generation wouldn't work. They'd say, I don't want to do that. They'd be given a job. I don't want to do that. Well, this is your job. But if I do that, I'm going to get sick and it will cause me mental distress. So due to my mental protections of the workplace, I'm just not going to do that. It's crazy. Weaponizing mental health is what I've heard it described as. Well, one of the things that I do with these clients is try to help them understand the motivations of Gen Z as my background study continues to go down that road. And for the first time, we've offered a document that should help you if this is something you're struggling with. The name of the document, I'm looking at it in my hand, just off the press from the graphic design team. 3 ways for Gen X leaders to unlock Gen Z potential. And if you want a copy of this, you go to cammarston.com/guide. Again, cammarston.com/guide, where you'll be able to download this document. There are many more than 3 ways to unlock the Gen Z potential, but we highlighted the top 3 that you can get done by the end of the day. So I'll say that one more time, cammarston.com/guide. While you're there, you can check out many of the other offerings I offer in my business that may or may not be of interest to you. Hope you'll take a look. Don't forget to check us out on social media. Always posting interesting stuff on what's going on around here. We have the Facebook thing going, but probably the most active space is on LinkedIn. And you'll see this guide promoted on LinkedIn there before too long. Again, cammarston.com. You can find me on the different social media sources. I hope you'll click, check it out, etc. Send us your email address. Trying to send now weekly email updates on things that I find cool out there that will help you in your own workplace. So that'll wrap us up for yet another week. You're listening to What's Working. Have a good week, everybody. As you likely know, this show originates as a radio show broadcast across the state of Alabama, and it continues to grow in both radio listeners and market. After it's formatted for radio, we then turn it into this podcast. Please share it with those you think would find it interesting, and subscribe to the podcast on my YouTube page where you can leave messages and your thoughts and your comments, and I'll certainly get back in touch. Finally, if you're a fan of the show, please offer a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can find my book called What Works on Amazon.com. In it, I highlight the top 10 ideas from the first 200 episodes of the show. Mind you, they're not the top 10 best episodes, they're the top 10 best ideas. Many times the same ideas are brought up again and again by different guests, and we dig into those ideas in such a way that they'll be easily applicable for your business. Simply go to Amazon and enter my name, and you'll find What Works as well as my other books. Chapter titles include How to Find a Niche, Innovation, Building Teams, and so forth. To learn more about the workshops and seminars I offer, go to cammarston.com. There you can view clips of my work, view workshop titles, view my reviews, case studies, customer lists. It's all there. If you'd like a free copy of one of the chapters of my book, enter your email address at the bottom of the homepage at cammarston.com. And from that site, you can email me directly. I always love to hear from you. You'll also find me on social media. Find Cam Marston on all the social media platforms, and you may need to enter the numeral 1. There's one other Cam Marston out there, and that numeral 1 distinguishes me from him from time to time. So if you're unsure if it's me or not, enter that numeral 1 after my name, and it should do the trick. On a more personal and less professional side, I record weekly commentaries that air across Alabama on Alabama Public Radio twice each day on Fridays called Keeping It Real. They've won statewide and national awards. They're simple observations on the world as it goes on around me, and they're only a few minutes long. They're a passion. You can find them on the same podcast app you're using to listen to this. Finally, if you're interested in advertising on this podcast or the radio show, reach out. I've worked hard to cultivate a specific listener, and I can tell you all about them, and I have many different options for helping you reach them. Thanks again for listening. We'll have another episode available soon.